So David, why don't we start with you from the Genesis perspective of identifying market programs. Tell us about how you go through identifying programs and what that looks like.
Yeah, so I lead a team of analysts, and we look at three different things, basically. So we start off looking at historically how have degrees performed in a marketplace, right? So we look at data across the country to look at, in a macro way, how things performed, how many competitors are there, how many of those are online, how's that happened over time, what's kind of the churn in that market. A lot of that data is backwards looking. So what we try to do is to look at more what's happening today and what's happening in the future. We'll use what we call leading indicators. This is the classic market research stuff. So things like BLS projections, we look at like Google trend analysis, that sort of thing. We also have a partnership with a real-time labor market intelligence tool called Burning Glass. And what they do is they look at job posting data. So it's kind of a listening tool on the employer side of things to get a feel for, yeah, we know there's a lot of data analyst jobs out there, but what are the skills that they need, that sort of thing. Lastly, what we do, so those are kind of thinking about things in terms of what's out there in the market, and the last thing that we do is really focus in on the school, right? And so we start to think about competitive factors. So who's in your area geographically, who's in your area, from a quality perspective, like who's kind of similar to you, what are they doing? How can you differentiate from them while still maintaining a certain amount of not being outside of the norm, right? So you got to always have this balance between being what's expected from the students, but also being different enough that you can stand out in a crowded environment. So we take all this data together, we bring that to the conversation, but then there's this balancing act between what the market's telling us, but then also what's the mission at the institution, and historically what are things that are trending at the institution. So we want to make sure that that's always authentic to the university as well.
And speaking of things that are authentic to the institution, I was just talking with Jan. You want to talk about sort of how you go through student demand from what you already pull from?
Yes, absolutely. So we do 6 8-week terms, and at the end of each term, we always send a survey to our students to ask several questions, but one question really stands out, and that is, what program do we not offer that you wish we would offer? And so we ask that question every term, and so then we start looking at that data and those trends, and over again we'll see the same things kind of rising to the top. And so for us, one of the ones was a doctoral program. We want you to offer a doctoral. We're predominantly graduate education, and so they want us to have that EDD. We would go as high as an EDS. We weren't a doctoral granting institution. We are SACS accredited, so we had to go through the process to get that, that change that degree level up. Also in the state of Alabama, just like I'm sure in your states, there are a lot of political hoops and things you have to jump through, a lot of competition. So whenever we say we want to offer a doctoral program, all 13 institutions have a vote of yay or nay. So we knew that to get an EDD, we would have to do something other than ed leadership or curriculum instruction. So we looked at what makes us unique, and we are very rural. So we thought, hey, there are EDDs in urban ed, why not in rural ed? So we sort of went that approach, and now we're looking to do more in the healthcare, looking at rural aspects. We're wanting to launch a DBA in business administration, and it's going to be a focus on rural ed. So we're going to take this and run with it because it's who we are.
Awesome. And so, Polly, is that a similar approach that you all use, or do you have a different view at Utica?
So, we use a lot of the feedback and data that David talked about from Wiley, but then we also take a look at where we're successful on the ground campus, because for Utica, we look at what do we do well at the brick and mortar campus, and then we try to expand on those things. And for a couple of reasons, one being we have faculty that know how to do those things, and although we'll hire additional faculty and resource the new programs, we need to make sure that we are doing something where there's brand identification with Utica College. So we have campuses in New York and then also in Florida. So in order to build brand, you have to take something that you do well and then kind of monopolize or expand that. And so we haven't asked the students. I think that's really interesting, and I'll take that back.
Yeah. And so, Eric, I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit about sort of the institutional decision-making process in the 5 gates and how that gets from the research aspect all the way to moving into stand-up.
Yeah, sure. At our institution at Concordia, we have a very clear strategic plan. It's got 4 goals: increase enrollment, retention, make sure we have applied experiences in the career space, and that we're operating in a financial fiduciary manner. And so when we actually have 5 gates that we built into any new program that could be spun up by either faculty, staff, administrations, board members, and so forth. The first of all is just what we've just been hearing. Is there a market out there? Is there market analysis for it? And we actually have a whole packet that we run through that includes national data, local data. We look at the iPads to see what the competitors are drawing up and so forth. So is there an opportunity out there? And once you get past that gate, the next gate is, well, are there students out there, right? There's some areas that there's a lot of need, a lot of data informatics and skill sets out there, but aren't a lot of students actually ready to jump into that. So you got to make sure there's a market of opportunity and that it isn't being saturated by the competitive set. Then the next one, just as we were just talking with Polly, is do we have the capacity on our campus to do it? If not, that's the next gate then is, do we have a partner? And we've actually done some partnership with the Learning House to spin up some tech programs. And then the last one, which is near and dear to my heart, is it financially viable? Every single program, and all of our programs go through this initial screening before we let faculty go into deep depth and work on it, because we don't want to waste anybody's time. And so we have expectations of a percentage margin that every program will operate, existing and non-existing, and ongoing. And we actually do an annual review of those. And we rate them as a red, yellow, or green category. And if they're in different segments, then we operationalize that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, if I recall, your faculty are actually a part of that. Like, they control the budget for their individual programs too, correct?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm being recorded here. You know, in the end, we designed a budget as a part of that business model on the front end. So, like, if we're talking about nursing, Polly and I were just chatting about nursing ahead of time. Well, that's got a much more sophisticated expenditure budget than my online psych program, which is mostly faculty, labor driven. But they do have the authority and operation over that. They also have the expectation of recruitment retention. We do 5-year analysis of number of declared majors, number of graduates, so we can get that retention capacity, net revenues, operational. Because in the end of the day, our goal is to graduate those students. And so if we start a program, we want to make sure that it's credible, that it can operate with fiduciary capacity, so that it has long-standing capacity.
Okay. So when we get into those pieces, we move into the ramp up, and I'm just throwing it out to all of you. How do you go about, who are the stakeholders that you tend to find that need to have the most work to build the consensus to launch that program, and how do you all work to do that? So sometimes what we found is that, faculty need to see that, yes, that it can be done. And so we go through and we will look at the accreditor, we'll look at, we'll look at like other institutions that have done it in the past, say, here's the case study, you can do it, and show it to them. But I'm interested in hearing from the administrative side, what that looks like when you're actually one-on-one with the faculty every day.
I'll start. I think, I have to say, I'm really blessed with an amazing faculty. They have already built into their approval process these 5 gates.
Right.
So even to get to that, to the next stage before they even vote on it, it has to have all these checkoffs beforehand. And that foresight to recognize that these things have to operate in a synergistic way. They actually created a form, so it allows it to collect all the evidence that either goes to the state of Minnesota or HLC, or if there's a third-party credentialing. So you don't have to regurgitate that in numerous ways. So it spins things along. And once something gets through that category, they can launch programs or get it through their administrative structure in a matter of weeks, not months or years. And what we see is we don't see this kind of separating of trad versus non-trad or graduate, that they all have gotten to the space of enjoying the opportunity to bring new product to market, to be a part of that piece, because they also recognize it's not, because it's done in a fiduciary way, it's not drawing resources away from them. And that's the key metric. I'm not stealing from psych program to start an education program. And university seeds that money through benefactor or operational dollars.
So what does that look like at a union institution? Is it a bit more negotiated?
Well, it's a little bit more negotiated, but we do have an internal process. So when you have, if I were to talk to legal at the college, he would say, just follow the process. You have policy, you have process, follow that, and you're all set. So we do have departmental approvals, school approvals, curriculum committee approvals, Senate approvals, and then that takes probably 6 months. So we are not as quick to launch as you are. So, and then we faced New York State Ed. So if anybody's heard about regulatory in New York, it is what it is. Yeah, it's easy, right? So, and then beyond that, in some of the growth areas, there's accreditation, program accreditation, there's licensing boards, and then if it's online and not on ground, you're dealing with NC Sarah and then state by state regulations that now we're going to have to make public. So it's working through those processes with the faculty, and it is helped a lot by, I'll echo the fact that, there's feasibility studies and pro formas and things that guarantee that the resources are there. So about 10 years ago, many schools didn't build new programs that way. Someone had an idea and they just ran with it, not thinking about how much it would cost.
Oh, wow.
And Nate, I'd like to chime in. In the state of Alabama, just like across the nation, there's a huge shortage of teachers. I mean, so sometimes when we talk about involving our stakeholders and our state department and our accrediting bodies, we know there's a shortage of teachers. So we actually partnered with our school district to say, what can we do to help you? And so we actually put our undergraduate teacher education program online, and we partnered with our school districts. And so we have a program that we call From A to T, from assistant to teacher. These are people who want to be teachers but can't be teachers because they can't quit their job. But we had to go through a lot of regulations with Kate, with our state, to say, we want to put this online. We're going to bend the rules just a little bit, but they already have an instructional role. But ensuring that you do meet those regulations as you make changes to your program are critical, because the last thing you want to do is make those changes to be slapped on the hand to say you can't do it.
Oh, yeah, completely. And especially when you move into the professional accreditors, I actually find the professional accreditors to be kind of a boon because they actually map out a lot of their outcomes already.
Yep.
It makes for the curriculums then be fairly easy. Like nursing programs, generally speaking, have the same 11 courses.
Yes.
And then you just need to remember how you do the clinical pieces and all those other elements. It's actually interesting. So we've been moving, I'm sure a lot of you use Shadow Health. And there's actually a new interesting one. They're doing it with CAPE, and you were working with AI delivery for simulations, right?
Yes. So in our teacher education programs, we want to make sure that they're prepared and ready. And so we're trying to introduce simulations. So we actually partnered with two companies. One's called SimSchool, which is based 100% on artificial intelligence. And so we can set up classroom simulations that look just like the real classroom. So the students can take like a personality inventory, that we can make the avatar look just like the student, will have the same personality, and so the teacher can practice the lesson, through the simulator before ever doing it for real, like the next day. So we're getting some great feedback through that. Also, we've partnered with the University of Mississippi, a product called Teach Live. It was based, I think, originally somewhere in Florida, University of Florida, I want to say. But this one, you actually have a live actor who's on the other side. So we would send the lesson plan to the actor. When the screen pops up, there are 5 students. You can have an early childhood or a middle school classroom. And so the actor then controls the 5 students. And so it's like a little Game Boy device. It's amazing. But the student can put his head down or get the cell phone. I mean, typical things that students would do. But that way we get to expose our students to what it's going to be like before they ever hit the real classroom. We have a funny story. We had a student who was going to come into the Teach Live lab and do her little simulation. And so Thursday night on a lot of college campuses is like party night. She comes in with her little mini skirt to teach her lesson, and one of the students starts misbehaving, and she says, "Ethan, that behavior is inappropriate." And he says, "Well, what you're wearing is inappropriate." So she runs out of the simulation, decides she doesn't want to be a teacher, which is what we want, if you're not. But that was an on-ground thing. But we can do this virtually as well. We're using our simulations in instructional leadership, dealing with a difficult teacher, dealing with difficult parent. So in all our programs, having these simulations has been key. And it's been helpful with Kate because we have that diversity and all those different indicators, and so we're able to do so much more than we could in the past.
Yeah, definitely. That diversity requirement with CAPE, like
Yes,
you're telling me
yes.
That's actually why you got into all of it.
Yes, it was exactly the reason. In our area, traditionally the schools are all black, and so we're not able to give them diverse experiences. So we can build classrooms to look like whatever we want them to be.
And you look at an accreditor, you name it, they have some barriers. You've worked with CSWE on the same thing. You actually had to talk with the accreditor to go through some of those pieces. What did that process look like?
So we're in the process of developing an MSW program, and one of the first things that a colleague from another school said is, before you even hire a faculty member, go through any internal process, call CSWE and find out what that process looks like. Because if you don't follow their direction exactly to the T, your first cohort of students will not have graduated from an accredited program because you start your program before the accreditation is awarded. And so we're working step by step with her. The faculty, I think, we haven't hired our faculty member yet, but the curriculum's almost done. So that'll be interesting for a unionized environment to kind of, that's how come we're hiring from the outside. I would never go to an existing faculty and say, by the way, I need you to start this program and here's your curriculum. So,
Yeah.
but the nice lady from CSWE basically told me, this is the curriculum and this is what you will use and this is how we will walk through this process. And I almost felt as if I was the student, because she was definitely schooling me in, here are the directions, you either follow them or you will not be accredited. Right. So it was an interesting process. And with programs like social work, the other complication is the clinical sites.
Yeah.
So how are you going to secure those clinical sites? And one approach that we've taken is partnering with healthcare systems, not just for one discipline or area, but for a range of placements. So OT, PT, nursing, social work, and are kind of going out and trying to get those relationships in place in advance.
So we're going to move from here into the actual development and running of programs. So I was wondering if any of you all had any questions on the stand-up aspects that you would want to sort of share right now.
Yeah. So I actually have a question to follow up on what Dan was sharing with the simulations.
Yes.
I'm at Murray State University, which is in far western Kentucky. It's
Yes.
very similar rural
Yes.
environment to UWA and Livingston.
Yes.
One of the hangups that some more programs are having going online in education is the requirements that, at least in our state, we have for live observation.
Right.
Instruction
Yes.
for teacher candidates.
Yes.
How is UWA addressing
Yeah.
that for those distance online learners?
We found a solution, and I don't have stock in this company, but it's called GoReact. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's you download the app on any device, your laptop, your whatever, and so I can sit at the beach if I want. I can be at my desk, and I can watch a live lesson happening in Timbuktu. It doesn't matter. So you have the capability of watching a recorded lesson and or a live lesson. You can attach like your Danielson framework, whatever instrument you use to monitor. You can give great feedback. We're actually seeing our students improve because now they too can watch themselves. You know, when you see yourself on tape, you don't realize what you say and what you do. But I'm happy to give you our contact information. We charge a $20 student fee, and it pays for itself.
One more?
Related to that, on the student teaching for Gold Energy, the long time block has been in taking a parapro away from their job to do the student teaching.
Right.
Solve that problem.
Because our partnership districts is sort of a grow your own concept. So we worked with the state of Alabama to also provide a $10,000 scholarships to these assistants to become teachers. So in return, they have to agree to stay in that district for 3 years. And so the superintendent, therefore, he won't make them quit, or she would make them quit their job. They work with them on placement during that internship.
That's great.
So once we find and identify a program and we get through the process of internal review and getting ready to stand one up, it does come down to the actual programmatic structure, and that can look very different for a lot of different reasons, obviously. But one of the things we tend to push for is the needs of the online student. And David, I was kind of hoping maybe you could just give us an archetypical view of what an online student would be looking for when they're going through an online program.
Yeah, so thinking about it kind of early days on the selection of a program, there's this sort of iron triangle that we often talk about where it's cost, speed, and quality. And there's kind of a balancing act between those three on the decision making. So there's a lot of students that today we're getting data on it that are saying, you know, they're looking at the speed of a program being really important to them, so how they can balance you know, kind of being a full-time working adult, but also being able to get through a program quickly. One of the things that we also see is that a lot of them want customization. They want to be able to, you know, tailor a degree to themselves, right? That sort of thing. And so what we advocate for often is to think about your content in a modular way. So think about having core sets of classes and then concentrations or certificates, you know, these different laddering opportunities where you can think about your content being applied into a larger framework where the students can really customize and kind of choose their own adventure is something that, and then what the benefit for that is that in the long run, you know, in the last few days, we've been talking a lot about technologies and how quickly they change and how fast things iterate. And what you can do is you can prune unsuccessful programs, you know, where you're only going to lose maybe a few classes instead of an entire degree, right? And you can adapt to new markets.
And so, Eric, how does that? I know your faculty are fairly well knowledgeable about all of that. How do they wind up translating that into their instruction?
Well, we take a slightly different approach. similar but different. We do a master class philosophy, so that we'll build out, one master class that's pre-built, fully flushed out, and then that instructor is flavorizing it with their own personal identity as they move forward, and then keep that refreshed as we expand into multiple spaces. And for us, that's been a really critical space of continuity, retention. Obviously, assessment's a big player there too. One of the biggest challenges, even in the trad sector, is integrated reliability. And so how do we build that out in a structure that allows that? And then assessing all the time about the effectiveness of how that's hitting, and you were speaking to that as well, is, some elements, some modules, as you were just describing, aren't as robust as others, and using that data. We also look at things like DFW reports and continuously to see where are we seeing weaknesses in programs, and then we would send them back through there's a rubric that we partner with Robin and her team about the curriculum review, and we'll do an analysis to see where we have strengths and weaknesses and where we can improve upon that.
Yeah.
So that continuous improvement cycle is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Jen, that's what we're doing right now, right?
Yes.
Planning all of that out.
Yes.
So what does that look like at UWA?
Yeah, so at UWA, we actually have 2 scheduled days that we call assessment days. You guys may have something very similar, but during that time, we meet with program advisories and we look at our data. And we also invite key stakeholders to the table. So we look at course syllabi. We don't want to have just busy work in our courses. When you talk about the speed, are these assignments real world? If I need to do a data meeting, what does that really look like, and what do I really need to do versus writing a paper about a data meeting? So we are definitely looking at courses, we're looking at course grades, we're looking at feedback from students, and we're trying to make all that better.
Yeah. And so the other thing that we notice when we do this, that we've been seeing, is that we saw this in the OCS survey yesterday, is that there's these little things that make the student make the choice, but it's not just in terms of enrollment, it's in terms of retention. We find a lot of students may not have the money to pay for their textbooks. So moving towards OER or moving towards on-campus-based resources, textbook-free elements are really great options. Have any of you had initiatives like that with your institutions?
We haven't. We're looking at, in our EDD program, we're trying to advertise no textbooks. We're trying to look at research. We're trying to look at, things that are out there. We're not 100% there yet, but we hope we can get there.
Okay.
In our situation, our curriculum instruction center is integrated in with the library team, and the library team is adamant about moving more towards OER models, and of course leveraging all the resources that are out there. If you saw the Chronicle today, there's a big article about schools dropping these very expensive journal article systems, and for us, it's about making sure that we are investing so much money in those that we want to make sure that they are embedded heavily in there in a meaningful way, of course, and then leveraging those to the value set for that.
Yeah. They're also looking not just for that, but also how quick can I get there? How much credit can I transfer in? So generally speaking, David, how much credit do you think a student's usually bringing in, and how much of that winds up actually being transferred once they come in?
Well, of course, that's going to depend on what level they're at, right? So
Right.
for graduate education, I think there's some norms out there. 6 credit hours tends to be kind of a cap in most situations where you can't exceed that. At the bachelor's level, it's going to be quite a bit different. You get students that are coming in with that 60. They may have an associate's, they may not, but then there's a number of institutions out there that are competing on kind of above 60, right? And you tend to see it a little bit more with some of these kind of for-profit institutions. They may have less constraints, but they're able to accept levels that are even higher than that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I just wanted to mention on our EDD program, because it's predominantly educators, we did give transfer credit for an EDS. So we allow 24 credit hours, which is a 60-hour program that puts them 36 hours away. And I can tell you, based on students calling, they're impressed that we take up to 24 hours.
We do that as well. For us, I mean, you had a big point here, which is about being transfer friendly, because most of the people moving into our online programs aren't coming as true freshmen. Now, some are, but the reality, most aren't. So how do we accumulate that capacity? And part of that a lot of that goes back to the faculty, really, is their openness to help match things up in meaningful ways. Somewhat we heard yesterday about the modular models, and being thoughtful and open to that, and recognizing those experiences and credits have true value. 4 credit, 3 credit, we're all dancing on a slightly different scale, but making sure that you get relatively into that space. We could take an English class, right? You have 5 sections in your traditional English 101 writing, and you know that they're not all getting the same experience in that same class that we teach. And so the goal is there to try to be transfer friendly and be cognizant of those credentialed institutions that they're coming from.
How many credit hours do you allow students to transfer in?
Well, they can officially transfer in up to half the major. That's within HLC, Higher Learning Commission philosophy. And so you'll see some people do that. And then the AA,
Yes.
if they have that, we are a religious institution, so they would still have a couple of courses there, but otherwise they would bring it all in. And so in a certain scenario, they could come in and take half of the major and 2 religion classes and would be credentialed to graduate.
Branching
Nate-
off this,
I'm sorry. I was just also going to mention, when you're talking about this, our master's programs are 30 hours, 33 hours. It's important too, when you offer that for scheduling purposes, we essentially take and offer it. We do fall 1, fall 2, spring 1, spring 2. So we do half the courses one term and the other half the other term. Courses like internship, we run every time. But I think having those courses available so that you can run them often also helps with that speed to completion.
Branching off this topic a little bit, I think we're starting to see a bit of a paradigm shift where institutions are starting to get more creative, not necessarily with transferring in credits, but waiving credits for things like life experience. And we're also starting to see them for that sort of thing. But we're also seeing the emergence of accepting MOOCs, and that MOOC to credit pathway is something that's really interesting. A lot of schools are experimenting with that, and what's typical out there in the market today is I'll accept my own MOOC, right? So if you go and you take these, 6 kind of online virtual classes, maybe I'll give you 3 credit hours, a waiver, or something along those lines. What's been interesting to me is to see the emergence of some institutions. I know that Harvard and MIT will both accept each other's MOOCs.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to get this situation where, and it's interesting, some of those are in partnership, but some of those aren't. And so with that one, there's no actual exchange or anything like that. They're just kind of a willingness to accept. And so I think there's an opportunity for a lot of institutions that are even smaller to say, hey, you know what, there's a handful of these MOOCs that are out there that are really popular. Maybe the pathway for that student isn't into that home institution, but we're willing to accept them. And that'll be an interesting change that we're likely to see in the future.
And another thing, so the interesting thing about MOOCs too is they started to do the research. A lot of there was this whole idea that the MOOC has gone bust. That's not actually necessarily the case, right? Where they found that if you're the student that's paying for it, your retention rate's actually fairly in line if you're going to on ground or you're going online directly with an institution.
Yeah. MIT did a study and found that a lot of the people that went through that MOOC to credit pathway actually retained a little better in the program too. But now there's a big whittling down effect, right? You've got 6,000 people in this MOOC, and I think they had maybe 40 people actually graduate from the program. So I think in many ways you have to still consider it a marketing vehicle,
right,
and not necessarily kind of a path for everybody, but for some students it's going to make sense.
So going back to thinking about scheduling and all that, we know that the development of courses is important, also the staffing of courses and working with the faculty to make sure that there are people there to teach them. That's critical, and sometimes we work with institutions that don't necessarily have that, they are having a hard time balancing the needs of their on-ground programs against their online, making sure that a professor who's teaching full load has three committees that they're on, and on top of that is living their normal life, if they have the time to develop all that. Polly, how do you work with faculty to make sure that they feel like their needs are met so they can run the online development and the staffing of online courses?
So there's separate chairs and directors for online and ground programs in many cases, and so the staffing is not always done by the same person, although the courses are master course shells, as Eric mentioned. So whether it's on ground or online, the courses have the same objectives. So we developed over time a pool of adjuncts, and then grow the number of full-time faculty so that the full-time faculty that are a part of those programs, there's enough of them so that they can serve on the committees and do the things, their departmental and school level work, and still staff them. That doesn't mean that they're not teaching overloads in periods of growth, and maybe not teaching as much over the summer. The other piece that we did is we allowed the faculty, instead of just teaching their entire contracted load in the fall and spring, we allow them to teach fall, spring, summer. Right. So there is a balance. One of the other things that we do is we allow our master's level students to TA in a class, which prepares them then upon graduation to then teach at the undergraduate level. So there's lots of different ways that you can be creative to make sure that the courses are staffed.
Yeah. Speaking of creative, you want to touch on professors of practice?
Yeah, I was just going to say, at our institution, we don't call them adjuncts, we call them professors of practice, and there's an intentional design to that. I'm actually not interested in the faculty member who's tying together 4 different adjunct positional roles between 4 different universities. We want faculty members that are going to be out in the workforce and actually bringing that relevancy of the teacher education experience, EDS, EDD programs, to bear all the time. And so that's why the relevance of a master class design is so critical. They're not building the class. Their job is to engage the student in that content and then bring the relevance of the experience and challenge them in a different way. But it's a different philosophy that we try to operate under as opposed to a traditional adjunct model. Even in the trad sector, we still try to do that as well.
And to follow up on that, the professor of practice at our school is a full-time faculty member who is non-tenure eligible, so a TE or professor of practice. And so we have the tenure contracted, tenure eligible faculty, then we have the professors of practice, then we have the adjuncts.
Yeah, we've actually added what
that's
used to be a
interesting.
term faculty, but they actually are now a non-research faculty teaching only that has full voice within the faculty, so they can vote, they can get advancement. Our tenure is different than other tenure. It's a recognition, not a guarantee. And so they can actually achieve tenure.
Yeah.
And again, I go back to our faculty have really understood that the higher ed of today isn't what it was in the 60s. And we can't live in that model. And shared governance is different than what you think it is. And so they built this model that you get a continuous contract, but it's not a guaranteed contract. But you get validated and resourced and financed appropriately. And if you're full-time teaching, we think about this, we're a 24 out of 28 credit teaching load. Well, if 24 of your credits are teaching, then that's how you should be evaluated for advancement or rank, not 50% research and service. 20, so that's a different shift.
Sure.
And it's really interesting. So we find that, making sure the faculty feel comfortable in all of that and that they have a voice in all that is important. And so I see a lot of institutions where that's the part of the curriculum committee. They help write those standards so they're comfortable in knowing that, yes, I've built a master course, but as a department, we took the time to talk about this is the book we're going to use, this is the piece that we're going to use. So we're all comfortable. And yes, it's a master, so they're able to iterate off of it. But from a development perspective, it does remove the load of actual prep. So you're just going in and doing the grading, which still, if you're an English professor, that's a lot. Yeah. But it works out fairly well. From like a carousel model as well, that would tend to be what we recommend from an enrollment perspective. How does that work from the registrar's office or from the scheduling perspective for all of you?
Go ahead.
Well, for us, just to be honest and transparent, we actually started in the cohort model, so serially. And then once the program scales to have enough volume, we switch to the carousel model.
Okay.
And that allows us to essentially, it's a reversal to the traditional model, which is what we've been doing in forever, but it all based upon scale. Okay. And so it's an economic decision when we make that switch. And we slot those around. If we have a synchronous component to it, we slot it around the demands and needs of the students. Exercise science is one of our largest programs, and we were having chats on Monday night. Well, hello, they're with clients on Monday nights. Right. No wonder they weren't retaining so well. Let's find another way to get that system put into place. And so lessons learned through the process help govern that change, plus the curriculum change as well.
Yeah. Jen, I saw you opening your mouth.
No, pretty much what you were saying. It's just based on, you can just look at what the need is and make your changes, based on that. But we do feel like we need to offer things often, and we'll even run classes with just 1 or 2 or 3. And so a lot of institutions won't do that. But again, it's based on that student need.
Okay. Let's move on in the iteration. So you're all leading fairly mature institutions, so especially from the online perspective. So I know you've had experience with programs that have needed to change or evolve over time. What does that look like? How do you go through reviewing those programs, and what are the decision points that you use to make changes?
I can start.
Go for it.
So again, I mentioned our program advisory. One example I'd like to share, we had, it was interesting, Coach this morning talked about college student development program. So we had a college student development program, but we noticed our enrollment started really declining. And when we started researching, wonder why, it's because the name needed to change. So sometimes our programs need to be refreshed, simply a name change. So we changed the name to Student Affairs and Higher Ed, and wow, look, it just increased. So just trying to stay current with trends and names of programs, or just trying to give your program, just a little boost of spark of a little change can sometimes make a big change.
And then you could also, refresh or jazz up a new old program by adding concentration. How do you wind up doing those pieces, David? Because you look at that a lot, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that we do is, I'd say maybe 2/3 of it's on the front end, but then the remaining third is going to be on the back end and looking at mature catalogs or mature programs and saying, hey, this is sort of maybe flattened out a little bit in terms of growth, or maybe declining a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll look at kind of a reassessment of the competition is part of it. And then also, again, going back to some of those leading indicators that we look at. So what is what are the up and coming skills in the job market? What are the things that people are talking about? And we do the similar sort of things where we say, you know, are you just named the wrong thing?
Right.
Is it a pricing challenge?
Right.
You know, so there's an element where in the kind of diagnostic, we're looking at, are you normal?
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
have you been around for a while? Did you used to be called, you know, a big data degree and that's kind of a passe thing now? Are you kind of hitting the norms in the market? And then also it's, hey, how do we actually differentiate and do something new and exciting? And it's balancing those two things.
Just maybe to add to that, so we do an annual review as well, and so we use those 5 gates again on that annual review. So what are those numbers of dedicated or declared majors? What's the graduation rates? What's the zip codes? We actually do little visuals on all of these for all the programs that say where they're at in their financial code. We look at the Department of Ed. And then, we're also looking at the IPEDS data of the competitors, right? So to your point, am I staying current with everybody
Yes.
else or not? And that allows the faculty to be involved in the process of decision-making about their program as it moves from a red to yellow, maybe because we don't have the right name, or the market saturation has changed, or as we've talked about, education is not as engaged or people wanting to pursue that. So how do we move that back into a space?
For us, we kind of take a look at the, is it an accrediting body thing? So PT, OT, nursing,
yeah.
their curriculum changes based on changes made by the accrediting body, so we don't have a whole lot of choice there. But in fields like cybersecurity, even the master course shell kind of falls apart even every
Quickly, yeah.
6 to 8, even every 8-week session at times, because something's changed and what the students in the courses want is an example or a case or a project or an activity that talks about what's happening right now. So the specializations, I probably every quarter, David, send a list of things the cybersecurity faculty want to do instead of what they're doing, because they're almost, their attention span isn't very long, and neither is it as theirs of their students. So,
Yeah, the market's moving quickly there, which is going to be different than other spaces.
so that program is always in redevelopment, I feel like.
Speaking of which, are there other kinds of programs that you find you're constantly going back to, not because of accreditation, but because of just market needs? Like which ones tend to require the most refreshment?
I would say like kind of, if there's a spectrum, the things that are more tech oriented are the ones that move fastest, right? I think in the last few days, we've been talking about a lot of skills that are about employability, about those first few years of a job, right? And those skills are ones that are going to be needed to be refreshed a lot more than the things that are maybe a little bit more abstract. Something like a leadership degree can probably remain pretty consistent for a while before it needs a refresh, but something like cybersecurity obviously needs to, almost on a semester by semester basis, needs to have a certain amount.
Yeah, for us, the more third-party credentials that have to be attached to it, the more frequently they're updated. You know, teacher education, CCNE, you name it, cybersecurity and so forth. To get that third-party validation, you've got a lot of tweaking and all ongoing.
Yeah, I think every social work program I work on is constantly continuous improvement.
There you go.
So have any of you had experiences with programs that may have struggled, and what was the intervention process with those particular programs?
All our programs are fun.
How do I get that bill?
You go ahead.
Yeah, well, we've had a number, and some of it is just a life cycle. We knew that they were going to have a period of time that they were going to be strong, and then accrediting agencies are going to change and they have to shift to a different modality. And so that's why I always trying to forecast what's happening. And as things start to wane, we have a philosophy as they drop into that yellow category, they get invested in a lot of ways: curricular, sequencing, instructor evaluations, DFW analysis. But then also, what's that external market? Is it drying up? Are there no jobs in it, or are there no students back interested in that job? So we lose those things. And then at some point, you're going to shuttle it or put it on the shelf. And we put them on the shelf. Sometimes we'll revisit them over time. But that's the harder part. But allowing faculty to see it happening and then giving them a path to transition to something else is what we found to be successful. You can't carry them all.
Right. And I was just going to mention, we started with an MBA and we had 2 tracks, general and maybe finance, I've forgotten. But our enrollment was not where we thought it should be. So we looked and we have now added 8 tracks and we're getting a lot more momentum. So again, looking at that, our EDD and rural education, we started with 2 tracks, leadership and teaching and learning. We already are getting calls. Why don't you have one in higher ed? Why don't you have one in counseling? Why don't you have one in library media? So we already know we're going to add 2 more tracks, one in counseling and one in higher ed, and it fits perfectly under that umbrella.
That addition of tracks and that customization is something that's really important. Again, that's something that students are looking for. We know that from their behavior. We know it from survey data, that sort of thing. But a lot of these markets that are kind of newer and growing things like healthcare informatics or healthcare management and some of those things, even social work to a certain degree. I think a lot of those are going to market with a generalist kind of track, but as those markets mature, especially online, you're going to need to start saying, okay, well, this is the lane that we're going into, or here's the 2 or 3 options that we have available. Yeah.
Well, and in some of those fields, it's about re-engaging the student. So we've heard a little bit about that here at the conference. So the more specializations you have, you might graduate someone with an MS in cybersecurity with a specialization in criminal investigations, and in 3 years you then have a malware specialization. And you can re-engage that student to come back and take that 4-course sequence. And in some cases, what we're seeing is in those types of fields, that kind of have a lot of overlap with something like data science or even an MBA. They can walk away with another credential by taking only 2 to 3 other additional courses. So the more time you put into your curriculum and the more you develop and stay market relevant, the more you can re-engage your students.
Right.
So.